Hey, math friends. Welcome to our week 2 book chat on figuring out fluency. If you are here watching live, even if you're not watching live, say hello in the comments. Let us know where you are watching from, how you're feeling about the book so far. I feel like I'm going to have a better prompt for the chat because I think every week it's like, how are you feeling about the book so far? Although will say that reading your aha moments, I can tell that we are having lots of light bulb moments. A lot of you are loving the book, which makes me so excited because I just think is such a fantastic book. So let me check my phone, make sure that we are live and that y'all can hear me and see me. Let me know in the comments if you can hear me okay. Let's see.
I can see lots of comments, so I know people are here.
You
I
can
know
see
last week
comments?
I can see tons of comments. And last
Oh,
last week I know we had like some volume balance. So let us know if the volume sounds good for both of us and one of us is not way louder or softer than the other person.
I cannot see any comments. I can't even see myself. Oh, there we go. Okay, got comments. So, welcome. If you missed last week, also, if you're here watching the replay, also say hello in the comments. We are so glad you're here. Um, I see we can hear you and see you. Wonderful. So we have fixed the volume issues. Hopefully that is no longer an issue. Thank you for those of you who let us know in the comments. But for those of you who are just jumping into the book study, welcome. If you were not here last week, the replay for last week and the replay for all of these will live on the Mix and Math YouTube channel. So if you can't come for any reason, you're welcome to watch the replay. But if you have not watched last week, my name is Brittany Heggie. I am the original math brain behind Mix and Math. And then this is Christy. Christy is our lead math content specialist at Mix and Math. And we are actually, you're not going to hear too much from us tonight. So we are here live with you now. We are going to chat here for just a couple of minutes. And then we are actually all together, me, Christy, and then all of you watching in the comments, we are going to watch an interview that I did with John Sangiovanni. He is one of the authors of the book, Figuring Out Fluency. I did an interview with him about this week's chapter a couple weeks ago. And so we are going to watch that all together. So Christy and I will be hanging out in the chat with you. And then that interview is about 40 minutes. And then after that, her and I will hop back on live with you and we will do our Q&A. So we've pulled 4 questions that y'all asked on the Q&A post. And so we will talk through those live. But of course, while we're watching John's interview, we will be there to chat with y'all in the comments. Did I forget anything, Christy?
I don't think so. And I don't know if John needs an introduction. I mean, he's the author of the book, but he also is just such an amazing background in terms of a well-regarded math educator. So if you have not checked out any of his other books, he I know has several. In fact, we did one of his books last year,
Mm-hmm.
Productive
Productive
Math
Master.
Struggle. And so I
Yes.
highly recommend all of his books besides this one, if you need more to read.
Yes. Although don't jump into another book until you're done reading this one. But I
Not
will
yet.
say, in our workshop that we do, I think I have a quote from him that, you know what, maybe I can go find it while we're doing the interview and pull it up because it's such a good quote. But he is a fantastic math educator. I think he is still maybe like you know what, I'm not even going to say because I'm not 100% sure what his role is, but I think he still works in a district. And goodness, can you just imagine being in his district and learning from him all the time? He is hilarious. If you ever get to see him present in person, he's wonderful. But we hope that you enjoy this interview with him this evening. So we will see you in the comments and we will be back after this interview with John. When I play the video, if you could just let me know in the comments that you can hear and see it, that would be great. I'm like a little panicked with the technology after last week. John, I just want to start by saying thank you so much to you and Jenny for writing this book. This book is fantastic. It is one that I think every single math teacher should read. It is
Well,
just
thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know Jenny does as well. We're proud of the work and we hope that it helps teachers, continue to grow as math teachers.
Yeah. So this week we're obviously talking about chapter 3, and I think that chapter 3 is so important because it really talks about that like foundation, the beginnings. It really sets the stage for building fluency. And I love that y'all just kind of like jump right in. On page 49, there is a section that I highlighted, and it said conceptual understanding of any topic is developed through the use of manipulatives and other concrete tools, visuals, drawings, and connections to meaningful situations. And so I love that you started in that place with these foundations. Obviously, this entire book is not focused on building conceptual understanding, but we cannot build fluency without conceptual understanding first.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway, and you're right on the money. Conceptual understanding is the foundation for everything. Do I understand an operation? Do I understand how to represent situations? And obviously, that starts with a physical manipulative first, and it proceeds to diagrams, and then those are connected back and forth before they're connected to equations and other representations. I think that's really important to know that we have to teach the operation and the properties within that operation and understand those concepts. But one of the things that can be overlooked is sometimes we spend too much time with the conceptual understanding, and students then don't have that opportunity to grow out of it and become fluent in the computation or whatever procedure that they might be working with. So we must start with conceptual understanding, make sure that's a really great place, and then begin to move out of that when students show that they're ready.
Yeah. And I love that you emphasize the importance of visuals and manipulatives. So I've got a first grader. He just finished first grade. He's moving into second grade.
Hmm.
And so it's so fun to get to do math with him at home. And, he's really curious about multiplication. And so I've kind of exposed him to it. He is, working on some problems, and he started explaining something to me, and he's using mental math. And he was actually doing the make a 10 strategy after he had,
Hmm.
done everything with the area model. And he was like, well, if you have two nines, you have like a nine here and a nine here, and then you move one over, and that makes 10 and 8. And I asked him, I said, what were you like when you were showing me these groups on a table? There was nothing there. I was like, what were you envisioning? And he was like, oh, cubes. But it was so neat to see him use that strategy without manipulatives physically there. And it was because he had that initial experience. And so I just loved that y'all jumped into like, these are so important. And it really builds like that mental picture that they use to basically apply these strategies later on.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny you say that because every human, me and you included, use visual models and manipulations to make sense of the world around us. And that could be through computation, it could be through spatial awareness with geometry and navigating maps and things like that. But it's interesting to note that many of us actually think about numbers spatially in our heads and how close together they are and how we're manipulating them. And though we may not process that or be aware that we're doing that, that's something that we do. And so that's why it's important for your student or your kiddo and mine and everyone else's to really have a strong visual foundation, if you will, of the math that, again, we're going to call on that through the rest of our lives. Maybe not in every situation. Many situations we just, for lack of a better word, know it, know what 40 and 40 is. But there are moments in everyone's lives as mathematicians where it's not instant recall, and so we have to manipulate the math in some way, and we call on those visual thoughts, even if we aren't actively aware that we're doing it. So, such an important thing. And then when you're talking about elementary students, what a great way to talk to them about what did you see? How did you see it? And not just for the efficient ways that they're doing it necessarily, but also potentially for less efficient ways that they may be going about computing or just thinking about math in general, and not necessarily correcting them, but infusing new ways that they might think about it, because efficiency is an important part of this conversation.
Yeah. And I think it's always I was actually coaching a teacher in kindergarten, and she loved to use the situations where students like got it right or they were really
Hmm.
efficient,
Hmm.
and was overlooking the opportunities where they were like just maybe a little off in their answer, or maybe it wasn't the most efficient way. And I was like, those are such fantastic opportunities for us to dive into and discuss. And so that's very similar to what you just mentioned, looking at the things that they do great and the things that they're still like developing.
Yeah, and you connect to like even basic facts when you're first dipping your toes into that, or multi-digit computation for that matter. But we might have a situation where students doing 7 plus 9, on double 10 frames, right? And that they're moving 3 from 9 over to 7 because it's the first add-in to make 10 and some more. And while that's fine, it's typically more efficient to build off of the 10 or the number that's closer to the next 10 or something of that nature. So again, having that conversation with students, having it with just people. People don't want to do anything that takes longer than it needs to, right? But at the same time, they may have perceptions about which add-in they have to start with or which number they prefer. And so exposing students to the way that others think, especially their peers, in those situations is so important. And it's not something that can't, it's not something that has to wait till fifth grade or fourth grade. Like kindergarten students can have these conversations if we are, ready to ask the questions.
Yeah. And they are willing. And I think in some ways we maybe have some of these conversations in lower grades and then actually lose some of these conversations in upper
Mm,
grades. And I actually want to pull out one of the quotes that you had. It's on page 53 and it's talking about flexibility, but I want to tie this to where I think we kind of go off in upper grades or upper elementary. It says, as students start working with 2 and 3 digit numbers, we need to make sure to retain the flexibility that is central to fluency. And I thought, like, I read that and I was like, you know what? Whether we have these discussions or not, we do encourage a certain degree of flexibility with students when we're talking about like decomposing numbers and all of that. And then it's like once we get into 2 and 3 digit numbers, we kind of lose
mm,
we lose that flexibility. We lose that like creative thinking. And I don't know, I guess my wondering is why? Why do we
mm.
encourage
Good question.
some of this in lower grades? And then when we get into those bigger numbers in upper grades, we don't see that as much.
Yeah, and as you go through this upper grades, it's not just 2 and 3 digit numbers, right? But we're also talking about decimals and
Mm.
fractions and other number types. And I think, and again, I think is the statement here. I think much of that is the perception of what it means to do math and quote unquote the right way to do math, and that lining up decimal points or carrying out computations in certain ways is the right way to do math. And so when there's a right way to do things, we have to fall in line with what those right ways are, and so that means being less flexible. And I'm not speaking necessarily just to an algorithm, but often I'll see situations where it's maybe something like 4 and 9 tenths plus 2 and 7 tenths, and a student makes an error or something, and the redirect is, well, let's line it up, let's put it on graph paper so we can keep our thinking straight and neat. Whereas you might be, let's be more flexible about how we're thinking about it and how you might shift and make a five or a whole or something of that nature. I guess to answer your point or your question, um, often I think as we go through the grades, we start to think about there's a right way to do math and a specific way to do it. And when that happens, flexibility starts to get factored out.
Yeah. How do we how do we challenge that? Is that one of those things that I guess
Oh, how do we
it starts with
challenge
us
that?
as teachers? Like
Well,
we
actually,
have to
that's
see
it.
it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we as teachers have to see it and do something about it. And to be fair to teachers, I think many of us do think in flexible ways. We just sometimes mimic the math instruction that we receive. I know that as a fourth grade teacher, I thought about, all the ways that I write about. I thought about math in those ways, but I didn't do that with my students always because I didn't deem that to be the appropriate mathematics for instruction. And so I think part of it is we have to be comfortable with flexibility. And in some cases, we may have to improve our own flexibility and make sure that we understand the math more deeply so that we can embrace those different approaches.
Yeah, and actually it's really interesting. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in the back half of this chapter, there's a lot of talk about like estimating and estimating. And one of those strategies is compatible numbers, which I
Mhm.
think is specifically called out in Texas standards. I don't believe it's called out in Common Core standards. And
Mhm.
that's actually one that's like really hard for me. Like the compatible numbers is just not how my brain works. And so as I'm going through and reading this, I was like, this is an area where I really have to focus on growing this strategy for myself because it's going to be really hard for me to support students and probably create learning opportunities for them about this strategy when I don't fully own that strategy for myself.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think growing strategies for ourselves, and that's okay because all of us think in different ways. And so there are strategies that we may not go to or they may not be called to as often, be they estimation strategies, computation strategies, comparison strategies, whatever it might be. right? And so being aware of the ones that we are not as strong with and finding time to practice them ourselves or making sure we call them out during instruction is really, really important. But also recognizing in ourselves that there are certain strategies we don't gravitate towards and knowing that there are other humans, i.e., kids, that may not go to ours, and so that's all the more reason why we have to really lift up that flexibility, not just in our thinking, but recognizing it in others.
Yeah. And I don't want to skip over there's a whole section about skip counting, and I wanted to make sure
Oh,
that we
good.
didn't
I'm
miss
glad. Yeah,
this.
let's talk about that one.
So let's talk about skip counting because we talk about strategies that we gravitate towards and others don't. I think that we see a lot of students who use a lot of skip counting and don't have any strategies beyond that. So there's actually
Hmm.
two sides of this. I was like, how do I want to bring this up? Because I think I don't want to demonize skip counting because I actually think
Mm.
that we stop skip counting at one point, like maybe beyond once you get to like mastering your multiplication facts. How
Hmm.
often do you see skip counting in classrooms anymore? But skip counting
Well,
is so powerful. But then on the flip side, though, we we stop at skip counting and don't develop strategies beyond skip counting. So there's kind of like two
fair
sides
enough.
to we need
Yeah.
more skip counting in upper grades and we also need more strategies beyond the skip counting in lower grades.
So counting is a prime thing to go back to that we all go back to. Counting is just a natural thing to do. What I would suggest or think about is that we don't count as well as we think we do in classrooms, and that's no shot at, I mean, at anybody or the work that they do. Counting forward, I think we do a great job with, but I don't know that we count backwards as well as we need to. Skip counting is often by an interval, tens, hundreds, and what have you. And problem there is when you add and subtract, you actually skip count by different groups and you're moving between those groups. And I don't know that I always did a good enough job with my second graders moving between skip counts. So we might start with 13 and count by tens, but then I wouldn't necessarily pivot and count by ones from there or something like that. So moving between skip counts is something that I think is, I don't want to say taken for granted, but just overlooked. Skip counting backwards, which lends itself to division, I don't think is something that we do or spend enough time with. And again, when I say we don't do this, I'm not pointing out blame or making blame. It's just something that I think we need to do a better job of. And I think our standards sometimes are guilty of it because they don't actually point us in those directions, or they mask some of the bigger ideas. And sticking with counting for a second, let's talk about fractions and decimals. I know that elementary and middle school students aren't charged with counting by fractions and decimals, right? Forwards, backwards, and in groups of. But boy, it's such a significantly important thing because it's a linchpin in multiplication, division, and so forth. So to your point, we need to do a much better job skip counting, right? And changing our intervals, and then doing it so much that we don't need to even think about it, so that we can
Yeah.
start to focus on other strategies. Like it should be almost a fluency in its own, if you will.
Yeah. And what's actually interesting too is with the skip counting, like so much, I mean, this whole book is talking about flexibility, like is having these different strategies. I even think in skip counting, I'm going to go back to my son for a second. When I was working with him on this problem, this originally was he was trying to figure out, well, what would it be? 9 times or 3 times 6.
Hmm.
And he was skip counting by threes, which he isn't super fluent, like skip counting by threes. And so he was like 3, 6, 9. And then he was like 11. And he was like, that doesn't sound
27,
right.
no.
Right. And so he saw, because it was an area model, he was like, oh, he was like 3, 6, 9. And then he's like, well, I see 9 and I see 9. So let me just add 9 plus 9.
Mm.
And it was that like flexibility and strategies. And I think the same thing we were talking about skip counting, being able to skip count. And it's not necessarily always just like, let's say we're skip counting by, fourths, being able to say, okay, I'm going to skip count by fourths. And then, oh, I can go up a whole. I mean, just having that flexibility within the skip count
Yeah.
is so
But the
valuable.
ability to maneuver between the ideas. So 3 counts of 6 versus 6 counts of 3, right? And he started with 6 counts of 3 and then saw something different and knew how to move or change his thinking. That is grounded in conceptual understanding. And I think that conceptual understanding is often like, do we understand the operation? But it's not just that, it's the properties of operations. And I know that many students can reverse add-ins and say, or insinuate that they understand the commutative property, right? But that's different than moving between add-ins, or in this case, factors, and realizing that I can move them so that I can count differently or draw it differently or what have you. And I don't know. I think properties are often memorized in certain ways and not really understood, and therefore not used as well as they could be.
Yeah, and I think you called that out in the book, specifically about how matching the property with like the actual like problem, like that is not a great activity to have students do. That kind of defeats the purpose. It's not that they
Mhm.
can identify the property, but that they can use it.
Yeah, I remember Jenny and I were talking about this, and we were talking about properties, and she's a huge advocate for understanding properties deeply, but not just understanding them deeply, being able to use them really well. And often the rhetoric around, again, the commutative property is, don't call it the flip-flop property, which, by the way, that's important. But I think there's a bigger thing that we want to go after as math teachers, and that is, do my kids use it intuitively, and do they understand why it's helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it. Understanding why it's helpful. And I think it's hard for them to understand why it's helpful when they haven't had the opportunity to see it and touch
Yeah,
it and
that's right.
experience it.
That's right. And I think also part of this conversation is, as adults, we take some of these things for granted. Therefore, we don't maybe emphasize or spend enough time with them because we just, well, of course it's good. Of course you understand it, and don't recognize that it's a major aha for kids. And again, as adults, we already know it, right?
Yeah. This makes me think we did a book study, or it was over Mathematize It, which is a
Hmm.
fantastic book. And we actually talked about the commutative property, and we were talking about it in the sense of multiplication and how it doesn't necessarily, like, depending on the context, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Like 3 times 6 is not the same as 6 times 3 when you have that context attached to it. And so I think, hearing that and then also seeing the value of it when we're talking about like number sense and fluency, I think it's really important that we're very clear with the goal. Like, what are we
Hmm.
trying to focus this learning experience on? Because um, I think I think the community property as a like tool for flexibility and like number sense um, is fantastic. And we don't want to just blindly use that if we're trying to actually like work through context. Like those two learning experiences
So
are not the same.
sure. Well, and I think that what's important here is the differences between abstraction, right, and representation and precision. So let's talk about 3 times 6 and 6 times 3 for a hot second, right? Three groups or three baskets of 6 apples will yield 18 apples, but that representation is different than 6 baskets of 3 apples. So that's part one of this, right? And I think the other one is something we talked about at the beginning, and that is we feel like there has to be a right way to write something, or there's a precise way to, exact has to be like this. And when it comes to abstraction, 3 times 6 and 6 times 3, that doesn't matter unless it's an explicit context, as I just spoke about. And sometimes like, well, no, this number has to go first, or that factor has to be second, and that's not necessarily the case. And so I think we get caught in these have tos, and it's only a have to situation when there's an explicit context connected with it, right?
Yeah. And I think you just said something about precision. I think also part of mathematics is understanding to what degree of precision you need.
Mm,
It
hmm.
just in life, like, because, and I think there was an example that got brought up during that discussion. We were talking about a wedding, and like if they were asking for like 3 bouquets with 6 flowers in each, but you brought 6 bouquets with 3 flowers in each, like that's a situation where like it needs to be very precise to exactly how it's listed. But in other situations, um, it doesn't need to be that precise. And I think about that actually brings me back to like that whole discussion about estimation. Like, so often in life, like, estimation is really a life skill, because
Yeah.
to some extent I think that their estimation is more valuable in my everyday life, like not thinking about
Yep.
like my career or anything like that, but my everyday life estimation is often more valuable than a very precise number if I'm going through the grocery store or
Yeah.
online shopping or something like that.
Estimation guides so much. It guides your decision making, as you speak to. It guides your, is my answer good enough decision making. It guides a lot. And it's something that I've been working on and really reading more about, because estimation is something that I feel as though becomes a procedure in itself. It's a rounding thing. It has to have a right answer. But yet in the real world, estimates aren't that. There isn't always a right estimate. It's a close enough conversation. And then we make decisions based on context about, is it close enough, or do I need an exact? And how important is that in the world we live in today when you think about it, right? We don't do a lot of paper pencil computation. We do it on our phones or with a calculator in some sort. And then we estimate or determine if that answer is, yeah, it's about that. And so I would argue that it's more important today than it's ever been. And yet, as teachers, we are less prepared to teach it than not necessarily we've ever been, but than we really need to be.
I agree. And it's also a really challenging thing to teach
Mm.
because it takes time, because it's not something
Well,
that,
yeah,
yeah, it's something that develops it just over time, those estimation skills. And I think
right.
that makes
So,
it challenging.
oh, without a doubt. And it's challenging for a myriad of reasons, right? Developing number sense and developing computational skills and yada, yada, yada. However, it does take time. And if we take an approach where we're estimating in some capacity almost every day with a focused discussion, if we're sure that we are not causing students to mimic the way we estimate, but instead exposing them to lots of different ways to think and estimate, and that means that we're comfortable with lots of different ways. Again, does it take time? Absolutely. Are we more gifted at estimating as adults than we think we are? Yes. Um, can we develop students with it? Absolutely. And it doesn't necessarily take a full lesson every day. I mean, I used to remember just asking to my students, wherever you are, estimate how many hops it's going to be to line up. Estimate how many, and just like that's quantity. And then in class, just little estimates of like, what do you think the sum will be? And we would write down four and then just find out. Um, so to your point, it does take time, but I think that maybe not the same type of time where we're used to thinking about.
Yeah. And I have two thoughts to that. One, I really appreciate in the book how you call out the need for explicit strategy instruction.
Mhm.
Like students have to develop, just certain strategies. And so with that, y'all talk about several strategies for estimating. But then the other thing that I thought was really, really helpful was that strategy or that estimating is not the same as rounding. Like rounding is one way to
Yeah,
help us estimate, but that when we are rounding an answer versus estimating to help us decide like what a reasonable solution is, that we might estimate differently. Sorry, we might estimate different in the sense that we might estimate to 25 rather than to 20 or 30 because it's closer.
sure.
So I did a terrible job of explaining what you
No,
can
you
expect
didn't. You
so
did.
clearly,
I'll go
but
back to the
I
explicit
appreciate it.
instruction. Let's go back to the explicit instruction in a second. Let's talk about rounding for a second. Rounding is a procedure, right? That can help with estimation. Rounding is often the poster child for estimation because it's
Mhm.
something that we can correct and say yes or no. And that's something that drives math instruction maybe too much.
Yeah.
And it's something that can be tested, right? I can test whether or not you can round. It's much more challenging to test whether or not you can estimate well. Let's say it can't be done, but not necessarily in the formats for assessment that we have. But let's talk about explicit instruction. That's something that like I'm often misquoted or mischaracterized in talking about. And so explicit, like we do have to explicitly teach students how to do things in mathematics. There's never been an argument against that. I think it's sometimes mischaracterized as, well, just let them discover it and they'll discover how to do it. And I don't think that is, I know that's not really the message. The message is let them come to the table with their own ideas, right? And then be explicit on other ways to go about it, or be explicit on how they can polish their understanding, or maybe even abandon theirs and acquire something else. And so, to your point, and to the point in the book, we have to teach students how strategies work, right? But we first want to give them an opportunity to kind of play with a situation to see if they already have understanding or to counter what like students might have misunderstandings that need to be addressed during explicit instruction. And if we're not aware of them, or if they don't become aware of them themselves, we can't address those. So I'm glad you brought that up. We
Yeah.
can't just hope that they'll learn how strategy works. We actually have to show them. Um, But at the same time, we have to be careful not to say this is the exact way this strategy has to always work, or when it always works, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think what has come up so often in the book is that the explicit strategy instruction is often built upon something that they know or experienced.
Hmm.
Is that correct to say?
Hmm. That is correct to say. Yeah.
Um, yeah, sometimes it's naming something that they did and naming it and showing them how this works and then giving them very intentional. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but there was a section about number strings and how we want
Hmm.
students to practice this specific strategy. And so we're very intentionally, creating a learning experience for them to dive into that strategy. But it's explicit instruction is not, okay, this is how we're going to do it. You are going to do it this way, and you're always going to do it this way.
That's it in a nutshell, right? So explicitly showing them how a make 10 works, but not explicitly saying this is how you use it. This is you will always use it this way. You always use it for these numbers specifically, and you always start with this add in for example. So going back to the 7 plus 9, or imagine it was 27 plus 39. Always telling students that you give some to the first add in. Now you do it like I do it. Now practice it. Like that's fraudulent because 27 plus 39 is a situation where maybe I would give some to 39 to make 40. Like, you get the idea, right? And
Mhm.
so explicitly teaching them how to make a 10 is one thing. Telling them you always have to make that certain 10, that's not um, necessarily a best practice because, again, there's different ways that students may think about those add-ins. So, yeah, I think we have some work to do there without. And I think that as teachers, sometimes we're not comfortable or confident in our own thinking. And so we devolve to a just follow the way I'm doing it because I'm not sure if I can react to a different idea.
Yeah. And I also think something else that contributes to this, and I am 1000% guilty of this, is when I think there's a lot of um, power, I guess, in teaching one grade level and really understanding that content very deeply. But I also, on the flip side of that, I think there is something that's missed by not teaching a grade level before or beyond and seeing how like this strategy may always operate like this in this grade or in this
Hmm.
age. But there are applications with that strategy later on where that flexibility is needed for students. And so I think for me, it has been such a gift to kind of move into the role that I've been in the last however many years, where I'm looking at a lot of grade levels and seeing, even in my own teaching, of like, oh, I didn't consider how this is going to look different in
Yeah.
eighth grade.
That's great. That's a great point. I mean, I was fortunate enough in my career, early career, to bounce around grades, maybe because they were trying to find the right place for me. Who knows? But the moral of the story is, as you bounce around grades, you start to see the math across those grades, and then you bounce into middle school or something of that nature, and you see, oh, this is how that came. That's a third grade idea, right?
Yes.
And so that is super helpful. I think that that's where, as a teacher, you don't have the time to look back at two other grade standards, and you do have resources that may help you, print resources, but that's where some coaches, or excuse me, some teachers have access to an instructional coach or someone who can help facilitate those conversations, but not everybody has that yet. And so to your point, it's really important to be able to see where the math may be going and to understand how it builds, where it's built from. Having access to another adult or some resources is really important. And just being mindful that your moment in time in math is not the only thing and that there's so much more to it, right?
Yes. And there is a chart on page 65. And, I'm sure you haven't memorized the page numbers of
I
every single page
have.
of your book.
65 begins
I would
with.
say, oh my gosh, it was the basic fact strategies and their
Oh,
extensions chart.
yeah.
Do you see that? And you're just like, I'm so proud of myself that we put this together. Like, this is
Uh,
such a strong chart.
yeah, I'm
Um,
proud of our work. I'm really proud of the discussions we had as we planned these things, and
yeah.
they make their way to print. But for every page, there's probably an hour of discussion. That's a lie, but you get the idea, and so on. But go ahead. What were you going to ask? I apologize.
Oh no, you're fine. I was just going to say that chart at the bottom of page 65 is such a powerful chart.
Hmm.
And I want to sit on this chart, but I also want to bring it back to the basic math facts because that's a part of this chapter we've not touched yet. And I think that This chart I kind of think has kind of been like sitting in my head for a while, even before I read the book, in the sense that a lot of the strategies, like being a fifth grade teacher, a lot of the strategies that I want students to have, um, they may be missing. And they were
Hmm.
strategies that really are developed when they are first learning their multiplication facts. And so
Hmm.
the reason I love this chart on page 65 is because it's showing how when we are doing this strategy instruction with these basic numbers, it is giving them the foundation that they need to be able to think flexibly with much larger numbers, fractions, decimals, multi-digit whole numbers.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
um, if this is like the one chart I could print and put on like in every school, so we can just see how all of this, like, yes, we can go the route of just getting kids to know their multiplication facts, memorizing it. But at some
Hmm.
point, we are going to have to go back and develop these strategies. But at
Yeah.
that point, we're working with much more challenging numbers.
Right. And that's why basic fact instruction needs to start with strategies. The end goal is quick recall, not using a strategy, but the strategies then are the underpinning for so many other things. You mentioned being a fifth grade teacher and, working in fifth grade or the grades, there's always this idea of like, I had to get them ready for middle school. I have to get them ready for next year. And the way to do that is just get them to that one procedure they're going to use next year. But what's misunderstood is that manipulation of numbers, like you see with the basic fact chart on that page or in other situations, that transcends grades. So the strategies I use with whole numbers work with fractions, work with decimals, work with integers. And there are times when middle school teachers need to reinvest in those strategies, right? But there's other times where, as an elementary teacher, I need to be aware that this is going to work. This is going to serve you, your students in time, and that knowing the strategy really well for fact recall or for multi-digit computation is an asset that kids really need.
Yeah. Well, and there is there's a section in the book that I highlighted, and it was talking about, let me see
I
where
need a
it's
page number so I can figure out where it is.
at. I did write down all the page numbers here. Let's see. It was, oh goodness.
That's
I
okay.
can't remember where it was, but it was specifically talking about how we cannot keep students from like grade level content because they don't know their basic facts.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I could remember exactly. Oh, here we go. Um, it is page 60, oh, 5, maybe 66.
Okay.
Oh, maybe I didn't write it down. I actually don't think that's it. But
All right.
you do know what section I'm talking about,
Well,
where
I
we
do know that
specifically.
later in the book, we talk about barriers to fluency instruction and that basic fact recall can become a barrier because as teachers, we've been led to believe that if you don't know your facts, you can't work with multi-digit computation or fractions or things like that. And that the way facts are taught or that recall is still developing, those things become barriers. So maybe that's what you were referring to. But even so, there are barriers to fluency that we really have to be aware of because we can fall into those traps and hold kiddos back with the best intentions, really. Not thinking that this is a big issue and that he has to have this or he won't be successful.
Yeah, and I think where my brain was maybe going with this, is that these strategies help them, thinking about what's one where we're thinking about like the distributive property or
Hmm.
breaking apart. Like that is something that is super helpful for students in fifth grade, fourth grade, third grade, which are the majority of
Yeah.
teachers in the book study is third through fifth grade teachers. And oftentimes we'll be like, oh, well, they don't know their multiplication facts. So they cannot work on multi-digit multiplication because they don't know the facts. And it's like, what supports can we provide students so that they can continue to learn, this strategy, using the area model or just breaking apart, finding partial products? What supports can we provide so that they can still access this content
Mhm.
while fluency with their multiplication facts is still being developed?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one thing that I want to make sure that everyone's aware of is that basic fact recall improves the more you work with facts. And so if you're doing 23 times 14 or 23 times 89 for that matter, you don't have to know all your facts to do that. Like by doing the work, you are going to revisit and get another dose of practice with basic facts. So that's the first thing, is that you need to work with facts in other contexts so that you can improve recall of them. So that's first. Second off, I might have students use tools to make sure they're accurate with those facts. I might want to stress and reinforce strategies of thinking versus counting. Counting is a practice at the beginning for certain facts. Um, for multiplication, two fives and tens are counting facts. But when you get into multiplying by four, that's when you're going to start using a thinking strategy per se. And I bring that up because I don't know that we always do a good job revisiting those thinking strategies.
Mhm.
And so kids go right back to counting because that's the one that's most comfortable.
Yeah.
And in those cases, if I have kiddos that are counting and that's their preferred recall approach, then I need to practice the heck out of some skip counting, right? So my opening routine every day might be skip counting by fours, or skip counting by sixes or something like that. And I might do that over and over and over again, and just make sure that if you're going to keep counting, that's not efficient in this case. We're going to get really good at it. There's obviously opportunities to give kids basic fact charts and tools like that. I think that's a good resource to have. But the one thing we want to keep in mind is that they may divert to that too quickly or prematurely. And so I might have to take into account some other tools or modify them. Meaning, if you know you're multiplying by, if you know twos and fives facts, you might get a multiplication chart that does not have twos and fives on it, right? Or those might be blacked out so that you're only using it for facts that you're not, um, you're not strong with or you don't have quick recall of yet.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you a question. We had a teacher
Sure.
in the mix and math community who was asking about hanging multiplication charts on the walls in classrooms. She said she's a
Okay.
coach,
Mhm.
and the majority of her math classrooms have like a multiplication chart hanging on the wall. And she
Mhm.
was like, I'm not sure how I feel about that because on one hand, it's a great support for students who need it, but on the other hand, that's their go-to is like, let me just
Mhm.
look at the wall for this fact rather than actually thinking. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
I mean, I think out of context is a hard question to answer, because every kid, every group, every class is a little bit
Right.
different. I think I would devolve. I think I would say it's a good idea for most cases, right? I think that I would be mindful that if I see that Brittany's going through it over and over and over and over again, instead of trying to use some mental tool, right, or some mental strategy, then maybe I'm going to start to withdraw or pull it back a little bit from that individual per se. Again, though, I can manipulate the chart so that it is not necessary for certain situations, i.e., multiplying by two. Like I might take that entire row right off the top. But one other thing I keep in mind is this. Every time you use that chart, that's one more dose at finding the product of four times seven, right?
Mm.
And every dose you have is one more step towards not needing that chart.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
right. And I think one thing that we need to do a better job of, and this is not directed towards that coach, this is really myself, and that is just having better conversation with kids about, but do you need it?
Mhm.
And having them be metacognitively aware of like, yeah, the chart's there, but I don't need it for this one. And I don't know if I always trusted my elementary students to think that way. Sometimes you treat them as little kids and that you have to give them directions on everything. Um, and we really want them to have agency about stuff like this.
That is probably, I think, one of my favorite things about this book. And one of the quotes that I wanted to bring up, but one of the favorite things about this book is just how much encouragement there is for us as educators to talk to our students about their thinking, ask
Yeah.
them what they're thinking, why they're
So see,
thinking that. And and just what you said, it's like I think it's really easy to not trust our students and be like, "Oh, you're a second grader, you're a fourth grader,
you
like
don't
you
know
aren't."
anything.
Yeah, like you're not thinking at that level, and they are so. I don't want to say that they're so aware of their thinking because they may not be aware of their thinking if we don't ask them the
No.
questions, but they have such rich thinking
Yeah.
that is so insightful when we do
Well,
take the time to ask.
I think we overlook the fact that they're people. I don't mean it like the way it sounded. That sounded horrible. But they have ideas and thoughts and feelings and stuff too. And sometimes they are treated just like little kids with the stereotypical way that kids are treated. And that doesn't mean that they're not developing and growing and still learning stuff, but kind of we all are, right? And they have ways of looking at the world and thinking about the world that don't always get valued because I don't know. I mean, I think we're getting into a different conversation altogether, but schooling has been an act of compliance for many students, and that's really not what we want education to be. And so, math, I think, is probably the biggest example of that, where it's
Mhm.
be like me or else. And that's not really how mathematicians think and do. And engineers are creative people. They aren't always rule followers. So, I mean, I think we have some work to do there in our profession, and it starts with us.
Yeah, I heard someone say that you're either you're either like creative or you're like good at math. And I was like, oh my goodness, like I
Yeah.
mean, you to be great at math, there is an element of creativity, like creative thinking, flexible thinking. Like it just, I couldn't believe that those two things were contrasted.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's something I'm really passionate about now. And I'm starting to work on something new about this opportunity for agency and what can we do to help our students become their own agents for math.
Yeah, I love that. I look forward to reading that. And I'll close this out with this quote because it said that traditional basic fact instructional practices of memorizing facts and using times tests have stripped students of their mathematical agency.
Yep.
Agency is a behavior where you feel like you can figure something out. And when we say memorize, we are essentially saying, don't figure this out, just remember it. And I know that that quote was about basic, like math facts, but I think that is just like math in general. When we tell students just memorize this, just remember this procedure, follow these rules, we're saying, you don't need to figure this out. And we strip
That's
students of that agency.
we do. The one thing we sometimes can be one thing that can be lost from time to time is that there are students who do think through procedures and do acquire through memorization. And so we do have to be mindful that there isn't like just like we don't want to say every kid should memorize, we should also not be saying like don't ever memorize either, right? And I think that's true for basic facts. When it comes to 397 plus 413, like that's not going to be a memorized situation.
Right.
So like that's not possible at all. But I do think that the importance of understanding and recognizing and respecting that humans think and learn in lots of different ways means that while we don't want every kid to memorize, it's unfair to say that nobody can either. And so finding a balance and more importantly, individualizing for students is this conversation. And I don't think individualizing is always understood well, right?
Yeah.
It's recognizing that we learn different ways in different situations, and being responsive to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, I mean, that's what we want as educators is to be like responsive to our students, responsive to their needs, responsive to the conversations that are happening in the classroom.
Right.
It is
Right.
such a like math is very much like a science, but it's so much of an art and
Yeah.
being in the situation with your kids. So,
It can be when we allow it to be, right? And that
yeah.
means that we have to be comfortable with it and admire it ourselves and let go of some of the stuff that we were led to believe to be true, such as this is the right way, there is a right way, and I know the right way.
Yeah. Well, I just appreciate you and the work that you did in this book because it is
Thanks.
very much giving us the permission to challenge maybe like what we thought fluency was, at some point just because of how we learned and giving us the strategies and the tools and the activities and games and routines to do it differently. So thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Thanks. And thanks to Jenny for being a great partner in this work. And yeah, we're proud of it. And we think it's the beginning of a conversation rather than the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we still have 4 more weeks in the book study, so it is going to be great. But thank you so much for chatting with me about chapter 3.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. And thanks for all you that are part of the book study and investing in yourself over the summer. I always admire that.
All right. Let me know in the comments what you thought of that interview with John. He is just wonderful, such a wealth of knowledge. And I thought it was, he just did a really great job bringing some clarity to some different things in chapter 3. So now we are going to jump in and do a few Q&A, or yeah, we're going to do the Q&A with a few questions that y'all asked. Okay, let's see. The very first one here, Christy, I'll let you kind of like, if you want to jump in, summarize this, so we can chat about
Sure.
it.
This is a question that I noticed. Some variation of it came up quite a bit with like, what do we do about students who lack number sense or haven't been taught these strategies before? Like, how do we, or they come to us and they're 2 to 3 grade levels behind? Like, how do we plug the hole, right? How do we make up for lost time? Um, and I think there were so many different variations of this general question. And I think the first thing that I would say about this is that you are not necessarily going to make up for years and years of lost time in one year, but that even just doing these, using these strategies for 1 year and having the kids be exposed to it will absolutely help them go back and plug those holes, for lack of a better term, with those basic fact strategies, right? And I think that that chart that we that you referred to in your chat with John on page 65 is such a good example of that, where we may be teaching grade level content of adding multi-digit numbers or adding decimals, but we are using a basic strategy like make a 10 or doubling or add a group or whatever it is. And I think even just um, having kids exposed to that strategy at grade level content allows them to then have that mindset of, oh, now this way of thinking is in their brain, and so when they do see a basic fact, like you might use a make a 10 for 7 + 5, I think I used that last week, it can kind of light bulb can go off in their brain to think like, oh, this way of thinking that I've been using for adding fractions is something that can also be used here. So that's one thought that I have, and I want you to add on to that.
Yeah. So I think that, and I kind of feel like I said the same thing last week because I totally jumped ahead and I was like praising the chart on page 65. But I think that it's to some extent, if our students are like have these holes or they're lacking these strategies, naming the strategy and showing them how it applies in a bunch of different ways is really helpful. So when we're talking about like even just, I can't remember if it was this chapter or last week. I think it was this week. We were talking about like decomposing numbers, and they talked about decomposing like 9 into being 5 and 4, but then we can decompose 3/4 into 2/4 and 1/4. And I think explicitly showing students that connection can help them both like build that strategy that they're missing and apply it to grade level content. And I think the other thing to remember too is I have some feelings when we say like, oh, kids are 3 grade levels behind, because like, what exactly does that mean? Because math is so like broad, right? Like students thrive and are maybe feeling have like unfinished learning in different domains. And so, but I'm going to say this, I had to preface it with, I don't love, this, but let's say we're thinking, okay, a kid is 3 grade levels behind, and we think that they need a complete year of instruction on this stuff, but they likely have picked up some type of understanding. Their brain is more developed. And so where a 5 or 6-year-old needs a lot of time with the make a 10 strategy within 10, our 5th graders or our 4th graders or our 3rd graders don't need as much time. And so giving them that exposure to the make a 10 strategy with a 10 and then connecting it to like a decimal is actually like a much quicker process. But they may just need that call out with those simple numbers first so that they can see that connection. So hopefully that made sense. But I think that chart on page 65 just, to me, I'm like, start with numbers that they feel comfortable with and connect to grade level content to show them how it helps them with their current work.
Start with where they are, right? Starting with this asset mentality versus a deficit mentality, thinking about what they do have and what they do know, and building on that, as opposed to, oh my gosh, here's everything they don't know, is going to be so powerful just in your own brain. And then exactly like you said, I think starting with what they do know and starting with those simpler numbers, even for students who maybe are fluent in those basic facts, it's still going to benefit them to see it play out in this simple way before it gets extended to this more sophisticated or complicated type of number.
Yeah, absolutely. We could probably spend a whole 30 minutes just talking about this question, because I know that this is something that we are very passionate about. We work on creating progression guides or concept guides, learning roadmaps. They've had a bunch of different names over the years. But I want to be mindful of time. So let's kind of go through our other questions here. So this was one actually that we promised we would bring back from last week. And I think last week it was talking specifically about parents. This week it's about like, how do we get the school on board? But really what this question is like, how do we get everybody, other teachers, the school, administrators, and parents on board in teaching math in this way and focusing on fluency in this way. So I obviously have some thoughts. Christy, do you want to jump in or do you want me to take this first?
You go ahead.
Okay. So actually, you had really good thoughts on this. I mean, I've got
Okay.
thoughts too. Okay, yes,
Okay.
you felt when you said let's do this question, I have a lot of thoughts. So I know you've got thoughts, and then I'll supplement. I'll add in.
I definitely wanted to talk about this question, but so my another thing that was an aha moment for me that I really loved in this chapter is they reframed that phrase, they don't know their facts, or a student doesn't know their facts, as they don't have a strategy. It's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily, well, it is that they don't necessarily know their facts, but they don't know their facts because they don't have a strategy to attain that fact or to work through that fact. And so I think just reframing this whole idea of they don't know their facts as they don't have a strategy is actually extremely helpful if you're trying to get other stakeholders on board, because I think most people can agree my child doesn't know their facts, or the third graders don't know their facts, or the fifth graders don't know their facts, or the students at this school don't know their facts. Well, if you say to them, well, guess what, when you're saying they don't know their facts, what you're actually saying is they don't have strategies. And so what's the best way to remedy that? Let's teach them strategies. And that's the power of actually teaching through strategies as opposed to teaching through memorization. Is now, if they don't remember a fact, they actually have a tool in their toolbox, or they have something that they can fall back on to recall that fact or to work through how to find that fact, as opposed to they memorized it and it's gone. They don't have a mental like filing cabinet or somewhere in their brain where they can recall that. So really, to me, reframing it as it's not it reframing they don't know their facts as they don't have strategies can be really beneficial in your case if you're trying to convince someone to kind of shift their perspective on it.
Yeah. And I think for me, like kind of where I came at this was a lot of times people just need to understand why. They need an answer. And so I'll give you like a little analogy, real life analogy before I got on the call, and then we'll come back to this is, we are considering moving. And so we're working with a new realtor, and she's a friend. And I told her, I said, I ask a lot of questions because I need to understand. And so she sent me this house. We thought it was overpriced. And so I need to understand how they got to this price. Like, what is the square footage and the assessment? And like, I was asking all of these questions because I just needed to understand why. And I think to some extent, when we're talking about families or other educators at the school, and I think someone last week said, like, how do we get them on board without just saying, oh, well, research says? Help them see why. And I don't want to keep, like, I promise I've read pages in the book outside of page 65. But again, the chart on page 65 to me is such a beautiful reason for why we teach basic fact fluency in this way, because we can see that these strategies are strategies that they need to know for upper elementary, into middle school, into high school. I've had high school teachers reach out and be like, I'm so glad. Now, granted, this is a model, the area model, but the area model is built on the distributive property or the break apart strategy. And so I've had high school teachers reach out and say, oh my gosh, my students who understand the distributive property from their elementary years are so much more like prepared for high school level math. And so if we can help other teachers, if we can help parents see, like, I understand this is different than how you learned it, but this is actually going to help them succeed or better understand concepts. Like, this is the foundation. This is going to help them when we get to upper grades. And yes, we could teach them like just to memorize now, and fine, maybe they succeed, maybe they don't. But at some point, they are going to hit a wall because they don't have this fluency, because they don't have these strategies. And so to some extent, I think like we can talk to parents like that. We can help them understand. And when they have an answer to their question and they understand, I think that we get a lot less resistance. And also sometimes them asking questions is not even resistance. It's just they just need to understand. Like, I just need to understand why this house is overpriced or priced the way that it is. So
Yep.
that was kind of my thoughts on it.
100%. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Okay, we need to come back to this one. That was a really big question. I was like, we've only got like 2 minutes. Actually, we don't have 2 minutes, but we're going to make 2 minutes. Okay, this one was, are word problems more valuable than standalone problems? And then really, I think we pulled this one because of that second question. Like, how do we bridge the gap for the students who struggle or haven't built that conceptual understanding? Like, the focus of this book is not conceptual understanding. It is fluency. But the authors made it very clear that fluency is built upon conceptual understanding. I think there's a quote in there from, I don't even remember who it is, but it's all, NCTM, it's the authors of Adding It Up. It specifically says that procedural fluency is built upon conceptual understanding. So how do we support students who don't have that conceptual understanding? And I feel like, Christy, that is like what we do all day, every day. That is the work that we are doing. I know we talked about it last week, and actually, we have so many resources to support with that. We've got our workshop that talks about the different representations that we use that helps students develop conceptual understanding. Mix and Math 360, our program is all videos and support resources for teachers and students that develop conceptual understanding. So there are some great resources out there. And a lot of times, like, in my opinion, it starts with us kind of making sure that we deeply understand the math that we're teaching so that we can create and facilitate learning experiences that develop students' understanding in this way. So, Christy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No. My first reaction is always think about CRA, right? Concrete representational abstract, the CRA model, the CRA sequence.
You just released a blog post on that.
I released 2 blog posts today. One on, so if you are not familiar with CRA, I highly recommend that you check out our blog on CRA. If you just go to mixedmath.com and you go to our blogs, it's one of the newest ones. And then we also have one on multiple representations and teaching with representations. And CRA and multiple representations are closely linked, but those are really the most powerful ways to build conceptual understanding, is connecting different representations and connecting the CRA, or in this book, they sometimes call it the CSA, concrete, semi-concrete, abstract. It's also called this concrete pictorial abstract. They all mean the same thing. Basically, this sequence of starting with hands-on, moving to drawn and visual models, and then moving into abstract or symbolic representations of the same concept, and how powerful, and it's so been proven so many times how powerful it is at helping students develop conceptual understanding.
Yep, absolutely. So the answer to this question is, if you hang out in the mix and math world for any length of time, you will learn ideas and strategies and best practices for really developing that conceptual understanding in students. So, all right, we are at time. We are so glad that you're here. Thank you so much, whether you're watching live or watching the replay. I hope you enjoyed this evening. We've got 4 more weeks of the book study. Next week, we are reading chapter 4. Yes, I cannot remember who is on for next week as far as the book chat, but it will be on Thursday again. And we hope to see you there live. Do we have any announcements or anything that I'm forgetting about?
No. And next week, you will not see my beautiful face. You will see Meg, another Team Mix and Math member. So you'll get to meet her. It's her debut for book chat. So definitely give her some love in the comments when you see her next week. And I will be there in the comments. I'll join you all, but I won't be on stage.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I forgot it was Meg next week, but it will be a great chat. And we are just thankful that you are here. So I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your day. And we cannot wait to talk math with you again very soon. Bye, everyone.